On June 13th, 2018, right before the start of the World Cup in Russia, FIFA's annual Congress met in Moscow. Vladimir Putin got up to speak and, acknowledging FIFA President Gianni Infantino, Putin said,
"I would like to make special note of FIFA's adherence to the principle of sports outside of politics. Russia has always supported this approach."
Okay. And then the 2026 World Cup host was selected, a joint bid between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
At the time, most soccer people were pleased, coming off an awarding of the World Cups to Russia and Qatar, and with fond memories of the 1994 tournament, the world looked forward to three friendly democracies co-hosting the world's biggest soccer party.
LOL, as they say. LMAO, even.
Since then, the United States is becoming what it once fought wars against. And though calls have been made to take the World Cup away from the U.S., even from Sepp Blatter, it's inconceivable to imagine Infantino's FIFA taking the logistical and financial hit.
And upsetting the winner of the FIFA Peace Prize
to take a stand for human rights or international law.
So we'll see how the tournament comes together, but just last month, the U.S. stopped processing immigrant visas for 75 countries, including 15 World Cup nations.
The State Department will still issue visitor visas after they check your social media history. Good thing you're not a visitor, Kirk.
Yeah, they would toss me right back on the plane. But even if you're allowed into the country, if you're a brown or black fan from Brazil or Morocco or Minnesota or Connecticut, you'll be very aware that the U.S. government doesn't want you here, and you could be kidnapped or killed by some loser in an ICE uniform.
I mean, I've gone to World Cups in other countries, including Qatar in 22. Never seen anything like this, which is why thousands of early bird tickets have already been returned, and talk of a boycott is spreading. My friends here in the UK don't want to be in the United States this summer. They prefer Mexico or Canada.
And despite some high-profile support in the soccer community, think Fox Sports stooges like Alexi Lalas and Carly Lloyd, most Americans disagree with the direction of our country. That is just measurably true. An overwhelming majority don't support a small group of racists, idiots, and billionaires trying to create a kind of Fourth Reich for dummies. And most people in our country don't support attacking our allies, including our neighbors and co-hosts, Mexico and Canada. And before you say, come on, guys, keep the politics out of sports, we didn't put them there. Our so-called president is probably, as we record this, gazing at that FIFA Peace Prize in the Oval Office and trying to remember what it is.
But our ancestors were immigrants who risked everything to cross an ocean and try to make a life here. Eventually, they found acceptance and a home in this diverse, incredible country. Our grandfathers fought in World War II so that one day their descendants could buy microphones and have a podcast.
Tom and I are patriotic in a way that we think most of you are. So, if you're happy with the direction of the country since January of 2025, if, after all the atrocities, you want more, this isn't the show for you. Please let the door hit you repeatedly on the way out.
It's still there? Great. Let's talk soccer, because we want to root for the U.S. this summer, but not in some dumb, jingoistic YMCA dance way. So what are we rooting for?
Well, the players, sure, this stuff isn't their fault. But also, we're rooting for a version of the U.S. that most of us want, that has occasionally existed and will again.
That's the spirit, Kirk. Our history is much longer than this past year. And we make this show because we love digging into our soccer history, stuff even most fans don't know, and we love celebrating it.
Without whitewashing it. As we like to say, our soccer history mirrors, for better and worse, the larger American story.
But we like to lean into the for better part. So we're going to look back at some of the history of the U.S. national team against its co-hosts this summer, Mexico and Canada. And we're going to find a lot to root for.
Hooray! I'd hope so. We're going back 142 years.
This is an American game.
When Tom and I were kids, the Canadian Tourist Board used to run radio ads with the tagline, "America borders on the magnificent." My family spent a couple weeks every summer in Quebec, so this U.S.-Canada thing, it's personal. I'm going to say it, Tom. Some of my best friends are Canadian.
I roomed with some Canucks in college, eh?
We both did. Shout out to Mike Cole, the pride of Oshawa, Ontario.
And don't forget Toronto's Jasper Malcolmson, the best man at my wedding.
Ah, damn. I know it's been 32 years, but if you had a Canadian best man, I don't think it's legally binding.
Good thing Susie doesn't listen to the podcast. One other connection to the Great White North is fellow Princeton Tiger Jesse Marsh, who is coaching the Canadian national team. But still, we have to keep some scholarly detachment here, so let's dive back into the faded scrapbook of U.S. soccer. It's Christmas Day in 1884, and over 1,500 people are crowded into Sportsman Park in St. Louis, Missouri. Through the driving snow, they watch a local side, St. Louis Thistle, take on the Western Football Association of Canada. It was the first international in U.S. soccer history.
And one of the people in that crowd was Thomas Bullets Cahill, the subject of our very first episode, who fell in love with the game on that day and would go on to become the father of American soccer. So the 1884 game was a U.S. club side against a kind of Canadian select team. In 1885 and 1886, teams representing the two countries played against each other. But my understanding is that technically, Tom, they don't count as international matches?
Yeah, neither team was a proper national team, but the game was billed as such. The 1885 game took place on Clark Field in Kearny, New Jersey. Like St. Louis, a cradle of U.S. soccer. It was home to the Clark Thread Mill team, known as Clark ONT for Our New Thread, which was the first soccer dynasty in the United States. The idea of a U.S. versus Canada game was put together by the American Football Association, which we discussed in episode 2 last year.
And which Tom has a new book about, which we will have a link to in the episode notes.
The AFA was a regional organization centered around the New York area. It had national aspirations, but this was the 1880s and the distances and logistics were just too much to overcome. So that 1885 U.S. team was made up of New Jersey players, 6 from ONT, and none of them were born in the U.S. They came from England and Scotland. In a rematch the following year, 9 of the American players were from New Jersey clubs, the other 2 from New York.
The Canadian team was put together by the Western Football Association, which was based near Toronto, so not a true Canadian side either. But still, the game was framed as the United States against Canada, so even if it wasn't official, for the sake of narrative, that is where our story begins, way back in the first, largely forgotten chapter of U.S. soccer history. One newspaper at the time described what 4,000 spectators, which included 60 ladies, witnessed back in 1885. Quote, "The play was very rough at times, so much so that the referee had to interfere several times. Once, 2 players indulged in a regular fist fight. The game's only goal came when Canadian Alex Gibson converted a beautiful cross from a winger. It was an elbows-up kind of match."
The next year, the Canadians arrived for the rematch on an overnight train and were taken straight to a Thanksgiving feast at Newark's Continental Hotel. Freezing rain led to standing water at Clark Field, so the Canadians assumed the match would be postponed.
A fair assumption. So what did the Canadians do?
Of course, they continued to eat and drink.
And a few hours later, they were told the game was on. And after going down a goal, the U.S. scored 3 straight and held on to win its first international 3-2.
And we'll stay in that first chapter of American and Canadian soccer history to celebrate what a joint Canadian-American squad toured the British Isles in 1891. They played 58 games in 137 days. The North American side had Denny Shea in net. He was that first great American keeper, who we featured in our Lone Eagles episode from Season 1.
We've told you before that the U.S. invented substitutions, but that 1891 joint U.S.-Canadian tour led to another global soccer innovation, the first penalty kicks. The Canadian-American side were awarded the first PKs in football history during that tour, and they were taken by two players from the Pawtucket Rangers.
Fast forward to the first official U.S.-Canada game, which took place on June 27, 1925, on a rainy day at Montreal's Alexander Park. Canada had played its first internationals the year before in Australia, and the U.S. first official matches took place against Sweden and Norway in 1916.
And before we get letters from nerds, yes, we know that Canada won the Olympic soccer tournament in St. Louis in 1904. Everyone knows that.
But the Olympics weren't sanctioned by FIFA, which was only months old at the time. So, again, not an official international.
Stop typing, nerds. Anyway, back to that official first U.S.-Canada match in 1925. The New York Times headline read, quote, "United States soccer stars are beaten by picked Canadian team 1-0, unquote. The subhead was, quote, "Losers attack furiously, but rain-soaked field makes footing precarious for accurate work," unquote. And there's a fascinating bit of early tactical analysis, which surprised us. The U.S. was a long-passing team that served in a lot of crosses for headers, while the Canadians relied more on dribbling and combination play.
Which you wouldn't expect to win out on a rainy day in Montreal. But hey, that's why they play the game.
According to the Times, the Canadian goal was knocked past goalkeeper Jimmy Douglas by, quote, "McLean, the lanky leader of the Maple Leaf team," unquote.
That's Scotland-born Edward Eddie McLean, who started his career at Albion Rovers and other Scottish clubs before moving to Canada in 1924. Like a lot of good international players, McLean moved to the U.S. to play in the ASL, the American Soccer League, which was paying more than most leagues in the world at the time. He scored 21 goals in 32 games for Providence, then returned to Canada in 1927.
Meanwhile, that U.S. team featured early stars like Archie Stark, Davy Brown, and Tom Flory, who was one of McLean's teammates at Providence. The Americans got revenge on Canada on November 8th of 1925 in front of 12,000 people at Ebbets Field when they crushed the Maple Leafs 6-1.
A year later, in November of 26, the U.S. won again at Ebbets Field. This time only 2,500 people showed up, and they were there to watch a 6-2 victory, as it was a big college football weekend.
Unsurprisingly, national team squad selection was a little less formal 100 years ago than it is now. As Archie Stark said, quote, "We just got picked and we went up there," unquote. They didn't train together or even have scrimmages. Some of the guys knew each other from their clubs, but as Stark explained, there were no coaches in our day. There were just managers, and they never came in and told you how to play or anything. They just put the name up on the bulletin board and you played.
Kind of reminds me of Thomas Frank at Tottenham Hotspur.
Harsh but fair. Also reminds me of the U.S. in the 1970s, but we will get to that. The somewhat loose squad selection and tactical work that Archie Stark talked about in the Canada games hadn't changed much when the U.S. first played Mexico a few years later, and the official soccer story with our southern neighbor began.
That was in 1934, a qualifying game for the second ever World Cup in Italy. Instead of a round-robin format, the 34 World Cup selected 32 teams and had them play a qualifier to make the final 16-team field, who would then play a single-elimination tournament.
Now, the U.S., which had been the first team to send in an application for the first World Cup in 1930, applied late for this one.
Yeah, they felt they should automatically qualify for the final 16 rather than have to play a qualifier. When I visited the FIFA archives in Zurich last year, there were letters from U.S. Soccer to FIFA making this case. Look, we finished third in 1930. We shouldn't have to work to prove we belong in the top 16.
Not an insane position to take, particularly during a global depression when soccer federations didn't have a lot of extra cash around to travel to or host qualifiers.
Especially the historically tight U.S. Federation.
So, by the time we blinked and sent in the application, FIFA told the U.S. they would have to play a one-off qualification game against the winner of the North American qualification, which was Mexico, who had beaten Cuba in 3 straight games. But because we'd left it so late, the U.S.-Mexico game would have to be in Rome so that the winner would be able to start the World Cup a few days later.
Mexico's trip to the Italian capital took 15 days, leaving the squad out of shape against the U.S. team that only took 9 days to reach Rome. Before a crowd of 10,000 onlookers that included Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, the U.S. won 4-2. Aldo Buffonelli notched the 4 goals, 2 of which came after an Eltree defender was red-carded. A rivalry had been born.
But the tone of that rivalry was very different than most people today would imagine. In September of 1934, months after that World Cup game, FIFA reached out to the U.S. Football Association to see what they thought about putting together a Pan-American Football Congress the following year, coupled with, possibly, a Pan-American tournament.
The president and secretary of U.S. Soccer wrote back,
"We desire to cooperate with all other countries in this Western Hemisphere, but we do not seek in any way or manner to play a leading role in any forthcoming negotiations because of the highly sensitive temperament of our Latin sister republics and their inherent suspicion of motives, often implied to actions or suggestions coming from the United States as the big brother."
I love how you bring that primary document to life, Kirk. Top marks. I mean, it's a bit patronizing, but the sense is that the U.S. is going to cooperate with these other nations, right?
And that was the same spirit of collaboration that had seen the U.S. and Mexico sharing a steamship to Uruguay in 1930 for that first World Cup,
which we talked about in episode 3 last year. The countries weren't drawn against each other in Uruguay, but they trained and hung out together for 2 weeks on the water.
It's a nice image to keep in mind if you only know the more recent and more heated history. Back then, we're 2 countries in their international adolescence. When they met in Rome in 1934, Mexico had played only 14 total international matches, and the U.S. had only played 15 since its first official one in 1916.
The U.S. and Mexico were young rivals, not yet good rivals, which is the name of a documentary about the U.S.-Mexico soccer relationship that came out a few years ago.
It featured our friends Charlie Stilitano and Bob Bradley, as well as the late and dearly missed Grant Wall. It's very well done. It's on Amazon Prime, and it makes the point that from 1934 through the 1970s, there really wasn't a U.S.-Mexico soccer rivalry. So the documentary basically doesn't talk about those years at all and picks up when the rivalry got interesting, which we get. That's why we're here. From 1934 through the 70s, Mexico was a developing soccer country, and the United States was in its soccer dark age.
And we promise we'll stop referencing ourselves, but it's a new season and we've got some new listeners, hopefully. So here's where we're going to explain that Kirk and I like to think of U.S. soccer history as 3 chapters of roughly 50 years each.
The first one was when immigrants first brought the game over, 1860s, 70s. It started to spread, leagues formed, we had cup competitions, and we played in the first World Cup. The game was taking hold. Then came the Great Depression and a toxic spread of anti-immigrant isolationism. I mean, a third of the country back then was listening to Father Coughlin rail against Jews and communists every week on the radio. The soccer leagues failed, and the game retreated back to its ethnic enclaves, an afterthought in the national sports brain.
But that started to shift in the 1980s as Title IX and the suburban soccer boom of the 70s bore fruit. A new generation of young players, boys and girls. The last 50 years has seen the sport boom again, bigger than ever, but that middle chapter was bleak.
So bleak that it pretty much erased our memory of the first one. So bleak that we lost a World Cup qualifier to Canada 5-1 in 1957 and wouldn't beat Canada in a World Cup qualifier until 1968, a 1-0 squeaker in Atlanta.
So bleak that the 1934 win over Mexico would be the last U.S. victory against its southern neighbor until 1980. Mexico went 22-0-3 against us over those 46 years.
As American soccer started to build itself back up in the 1970s and 80s, Mexico and Canada could look up and down at a long dormant giant that could become a problem when those new soccer kids grew up, but was still easy to pick on in the meantime.
That's because Mexico didn't have a soccer dark age. English miners from Cornwall, England brought their ball with them in the late 19th century. A quasi-national league was set up by the early 1920s, and the Federación Mexicana de Fútbol Asociación, or the FAMAF, was formed in 1927. The national team played in the first two World Cups, so football was the national sport by the 1930s. But then, Mexico's young soccer culture got an injection of talent. Refugees from the Spanish Civil War.
General Francisco Franco's coup in July of 1936 kicked off that civil war, which had an immediate impact on, among many things, Spanish soccer. La Liga was suspended, players were recruited to fight on both sides, and in August, the president of FC Barcelona was killed by Franco's soldiers at a roadside checkpoint. By the beginning of 1937, Barca was facing financial ruin. And then a Catalan businessman, Manuel Mas Soriano, who had moved to Mexico but had grown up playing for the Barcelona baseball team, invited the club to do a tour for $15,000 and all expenses paid.
Barcelona had a baseball team? Amazing. What was originally planned as 5 games over 3 weeks became 14 matches, 10 in Mexico, 4 in the U.S. The income from the tour saved FC Barcelona. And when 7 players decided not to return to war-ravaged Spain, they helped build Mexican football.
The star of that Barca team was Martí Ventura, a winger who played for Spain in the 1934 World Cup. His son Jose would play in the 1970 World Cup for Mexico. They were the first father-son pair to play in World Cups for different countries.
And after Barcelona came a tour by the Basque national team, Team Euskadi, which was the local name for the Basque homelands. They were fresh off a European tour and scheduled to play an exhibition series in Mexico. But with the Basque country about to fall to nationalist forces, Team Euskadi was ordered to come home by Franco's new Spanish Football Federation. The players refused and boarded a steamship in Le Havre in August 1937, headed for Mexico.
So FIFA did what FIFA has historically done best and sided with a dictator. It informed the Mexican Football Federation that no Mexican team was allowed to play the Basques. FMF's president and top officials responded by greeting the Basque team's ship when it docked in Veracruz on November 3rd.
Team Euskadi played 4 games against the Mexican national team, winning 3 and 5 against club sides. Then, in January of 1938, they took off for South America. But by the time they got there, Argentina informed them that they were going to obey FIFA and not let Team Euskadi play any of their games.
This was devastating for the Basque team, which had spent all of its money getting there. In August, the players finally made it back to Mexico and, unable to go home, registered as Club Deportivo Euskadi and played for a year in the Mexican League.
And when the Spanish Civil War ended in April of 1939, some of the players went home. But others settled in Mexico, growing the game.
So the decades of U.S. soccer stagnation were Mexico's boom years. The U.S. and Mexican teams crossed paths occasionally, like in 1957.
The year that our friend James Brown's father earned his one and only cap for the United States. George Brown is in his early 90s now, and his father James was a winger for the U.S.'s first World Cup squad in 1930. He scored a goal in our semifinal loss in Argentina. James Brown, the vice president of the Society for American Soccer History, once again shared some family documents with us.
We've got a letter that George Brown received from the United States Soccer Football Association in March 1957, inviting him to represent his country in what was called the forthcoming Jules Rimet World Cup Elimination Tournament. The typewritten letter read, quote, "The USSFA will furnish the jersey, soccer pants, and soccer stockings. The rest of your equipment, such as football shoes, inner socks, shin guards, knee or ankle guards, or any other personal items we expect you to provide. Particular attention should be paid to your soccer shoes. The studs should be in good condition and high, as you will be playing on grass ground."
Ooh, grass. George and the other invitees mostly played on dirt pitches, so the grass field in Mexico City was going to be fantastic, and it would require better studs. George had his father's old boots, clunky, high-top leather ones. He hated them, he said. More on that in a minute.
The Federation did pay for airfare. George and his teammates arrived on an Air France flight on April 5th after a long but pleasant ride. We know this because George kept a diary of the trip on his Hotel del Prado stationery.
Ooh, more primary documents. George Brown's mostly legible cursive also revealed a group of players ditching the team trainer for a night out. They hung out with some locals at a nightclub, La Ria Rosa. George noted in his diary, quote, "We had a good laugh with our poor knowledge of Spanish and their complete lack of English. It seems all they could say was, 2 drinks, please."
The squad trained at the stadium the next day, and that afternoon, George visited the city's main soccer store. He bought himself a new pair of boots, which were, quote, soft-toed Mexican ones, unquote, and also 2 balls. Spent 210 pesos, or about $17 on the whole thing. He also did some souvenir shopping and had a steak dinner before making curfew at 11 p.m.
But Eltree crushed the U.S. the next day, 6-0, before 75,000 fans. George wrote about how the Mexican squad trained together for months prior to the qualifiers and how the altitude impacted the ill-prepared Americans. He did not mention getting knocked unconscious by the goalkeeper, Antonio Carvajal, who appeared in 5 straight World Cups for Mexico from 1950 to 1966. There is a picture of a concerned Carvajal looking over George as the U.S. trainer attends to him. He eventually came to and finished the match.
Possible traumatic brain injury aside, it was a fun trip for George Brown and the rest of the U.S. team. I mean, they weren't getting batteries and bags of urine thrown at them because, well, the U.S. wasn't worth getting too worked up about.
It was George's only cap, and when the U.S. faced Mexico 3 weeks later in Long Beach, California, a significant player stepped on for the first time.
This was Ruben Mendoza, who was the first Mexican-American to play for the U.S. men's national team. He was born in St. Louis in 1931, and when he was 8 years old, Ruben's mother moved the family back to the Mexican state of Durango, where he chased the ball around on its dusty streets. He returned to St. Louis for high school and earned his first full cap against Haiti in 1954. He scored against Mexico in that 1957 game, although the U.S. lost 7-2. Mendoza played another 2 times for the U.S., as well as making 3 Olympic teams, before knee injuries moved him from playing to coaching and, eventually, the St. Louis Soccer Hall of Fame.
Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. couldn't beat Mexico or Canada in World Cup qualifying, or pretty much anyone else. Another national teamer we spoke to, Peter Millar, once told me about the level of the national team training back then. He said you'd get a letter or a telegram to report at a particular stadium. No training camp. We'd do a couple of wind sprints in the parking lot the night before and play the next day, he said.
You see, it sounds like Archie Stark in the 1920s. So while Mexico was building off the success of hosting the 1970 tournament, which was the first one broadcast in Technicolor, where Eltree made it to the quarterfinals, the U.S. national team coach was, in 1973, and this is real, a New Jersey high school coach.
This was Gene Chisowitz from my hometown. We called him Mr. C. A Ukrainian refugee from Poland, he settled in Philadelphia at 13 after arriving on a U.S. Navy ship. Chisowitz went to North Catholic before going to Temple University. In 1970, he got the top coaching license from the U.S. Soccer Federation, and then spent a half-century at Columbia High School, turning it into a perennial state powerhouse. And yes, for a year, he was asked to coach both the full national and Olympic teams.
He went 3-2, which honestly, not bad.
Not bad. I interviewed him once about those days, and he talked about the gamesmanship prior to one U.S.-Mexico match. Mr. C said, quote, "I said we needed some water in every room at the hotel. They responded, 'We have no water.' 'What do you mean? You have to have water,' I said. We had to drink beer for 3 days before the water truck arrived." End quote.
Chisowitz passed in 2014, so we reached out to some players to verify that story, Bobby Smith, who grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, and played for the Philadelphia Atoms and New York Cosmos in the North American Soccer League, the NASL, didn't specifically remember the beer, but also said it would not have surprised him. He did remember the lack of preparation. Quote, "We flew in, had one training session, and played the game the next day," unquote.
Recurring theme. But then, in 1976, Gene's younger brother Walt got the national team job.
And for the first time in U.S. soccer history, it was full-time. And on the excitement of the coach of the U.S. national team being a full-time paid position, we're going to take a quick break and be right back with U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
If you like what you're hearing, click to follow an American game so you won't miss future stories about U.S. soccer.
We've got some good ones lined up to get you ready for the World Cup this summer.
It's U.S. soccer at the intersection of history
and Hollywood. It's stuff most people don't know, but we really think you should.
And if you like it, we hope you share it.
You know how it works. Give it a like, subscribe, tell your friends. And in the meantime, actually, seriously, go do that now. Go do all three of those things right now. And then come back and enjoy the rest of the show.
We're back. It's 1976, our bicentennial year, and Walt Chiszewicz has been hired by U.S. Soccer with a mandate to identify and mold players who could make a serious run at qualifying for the 1978 and 82 World Cups.
And for the first time in a long time, this felt possible in the U.S.
Yeah, there were guys who were born in the U.S. who've been playing their whole lives. We're talking organized club and high school ball before starring in college. And then some went on to the NASL, guys like Dave DeRico and Bobby Smith from New Jersey, as well as Steve Petcher and Al Trost from St. Louis.
Plus, in the great American tradition, we had top players like Julie V and Santiago Formoso, born elsewhere but raised in the U.S. Qualifying kicked off in 1976 as the U.S. was put in a three-team preliminary group with, and this is right on theme, Canada and Mexico. It was called the North American Zone, which we're sure Mexico loved. The top two teams from this three-team group would move to full CONCACAF qualifying against whoever came out of the Central American and Caribbean zones.
We've mentioned how Mexican soccer has progressed, but Canada was also on the rise due to some of the same trends we saw in the U.S. More Canadian-born kids were playing, some of whom went on to college ball and then the NASL.
Plus, immigrants. Canadian immigration policy opened up in the 1960s, doing away with race-based or national barriers and bringing more diversity to the Canadian population, including the soccer player pool.
But the early results for the U.S. were promising. Ties against Canada in Vancouver and against Mexico at the LA Coliseum. A loss in the next Mexico game was expected, but a win at home against Canada at the Seattle Kingdome set up a one-game playoff between the North American neighbors.
And Canada smacked the U.S. 3-0.
Pressure mounted on Walt Chiszewicz in 1980 when it came time to qualify for the 1982 World Cup in Spain. He'd been given 4 years of recruiting, training, and competing. And with 5 U.S. players on the NASL powerhouse, the Cosmos, our team, surely Ricky Davis, Mark Liverich, Angelo DiBernardo, Boris Bandoff, and Larry Holcher could get it done.
Once again, the U.S. was put in the North American zone with Canada and Mexico. Once again, they just needed to not be the worst of the three. To help the U.S. cause, the Cosmos released all of those good U.S. players for a month-long tour of Europe to get ready. And to hurt the Canadian cause, the Cosmos refused to release their Canadian star, Bruce Wilson.
Barry Clark, the Canadian coach, was pissed. We have been conned and we have been hoodwinked and it's going to stop. I've told the U.S. to look up the meaning of the word sincerity because I'm fed up with Canada always playing the gentleman and suffering for it. Eh?
Yeah. Remember that quote, eh? We'll come back to it in a few minutes. But all the administrative dark arts didn't help on the field. The U.S. lost and drew against Canada and then got beat 5-1 at the Azteca in front of 90,000 people.
Soccer folks began to call for Walt's head, including Cosmos great Giorgio Canaglia. And I have been waiting for this. I want to hear Kirk's imitation.
For the U.S. team to not qualify for the World Cup is a disaster, especially when we had such a great opportunity to qualify. We had so many great players in the NASL this year, but the coach, he ignored the best ones.
We got to get Charlie Stillentano to weigh in on that imitation, or Francesco Campagna. Walt Chislewicz.
Que cosa?
Yeah.
Que cosa, Walt Chislewicz? Que cosa?
Walt wasn't one to back down. We have 50 players in America, he told Alex Yanis of the New York Times, and maybe 25 of them can play at a certain standard. Let's not have illusions. We're not even close.
But Canada was.
And if this show is at the intersection of soccer history and Hollywood, then that Team Canada squad was at the intersection of a golden generation and an uncertain future. Remember that the NASL had just shut down.
Canada had to rely on a combination of those NASL dropouts and out-of-work players to qualify for its first ever World Cup, but they made it. And they faced three really tough sides: Michel Platini's France, the USSR, and Hungary. And while they didn't win any of the games, they did their country proud, though the Hungarian game wasn't shown live on Canadian television because it was preempted by Sesame Street.
In 1990, the U.S. put it together, barely, and made it back to the World Cup, thanks to a wonder goal from Paul Caligiuri against Trinidad and Tobago, which we talked about in our documentary, Soccertown, USA. But what we didn't mention was the part that Mexico played in that qualification. This was the Cachi Rules scandal. Ooh, I love some scandal. When the Mexican Federation was found to have doctored passports, knowingly using at least 4 overage players on their U20 team. The punishment was a ban for all Mexican teams in all FIFA competitions, meaning Mexico couldn't play in the 88 Olympics or the 90 World Cup.
When FIFA's executive committee had a meeting to announce the punishment, the Mexican representative left before it was over and refused to comment. FIFA said no appeal was possible. And while a FIFA spokesman said that the harsh punishment was, quote, a strong warning for others contemplating cheating on age limits, unquote, a lot of people questioned it.
Yeah, because this wasn't the first time there were issues with birth years on youth teams. But full national teams weren't punished for youthful transgressions. There were whispers that FIFA put a thumb on the North American zone to help the U.S. make it to Italy in 1990.
We're not here to take a side on that conspiracy theory, but we are more than happy to share it because, taking nothing away from that U.S. team, it's FIFA. It's possible. And it is more context for the contentious U.S.-Mexico rivalry that has developed over the last few decades, which we're not going to get into because it has been well documented elsewhere. Dos a Cero, Fortress Columbus, Rafa Marquez, Landon Donovan, Man in the Mirror.
Alexei getting kneed in the nether regions. My son was 11 in 2009 when I took him to one of those Dos a Cero games in the windy rain of Columbus, Ohio. He had to miss school the next day, but I sent in a fake doctor's note signed by none other than Dr. Arsene Wenger.
Tom and I figured if you're listening to this, you are somewhat familiar with the current era of U.S. soccer. And there's not much we would add to the recent U.S. versus Mexico story that isn't out there already in, say, that Good Rivals documentary.
And not to oversimplify it, much of the recent U.S.-Canada soccer rivalry has been defined by what that Canadian coach described as, quote, Canada always playing the gentleman and suffering for it, end quote.
But a lot of U.S. soccer media tells a story that starts and ends with this era. There's a moment in Good Rivals when Don Garber, the longtime commissioner of MLS, says, quote, over the last 20 years, we've created this incredible soccer nation in our country, unquote. And sure, the game has boomed recently, but part of what we wanted to do in this episode, in this series, is show that while we have had our dark ages, the U.S. has been a soccer nation for a long time. And our history with Canada and Mexico goes back a lot farther than most people realize.
We also wanted to look ahead to this summer and to point out that while our political relationships with our neighbors have rarely been worse, our soccer relationships have rarely been more interconnected. Like, the U.S. is known for trying to stack its team with dual internationals. But in the last decade, Mexico has come north to find dual national talent.
Jonathan Gonzalez made headlines in 2018 when he switched from the U.S. national team pool to Mexico. And a bunch of players, including recently Brian Gutierrez and Richard Ledesma, have made the same choice.
Meanwhile, Mexican-American Ricardo Pepe is expected to be a big part of the U.S. squad this summer, as well as Alex Zendejas, another El Pasoan. Dr. Geraldo Moreira spoke to us about El Paso, just across the border from Juarez, Mexico. A fascinating soccer-football culture has developed there. We're going to save that for another Soccer Towns episode.
Just as the U.S. national team is no longer the exclusive domain of white suburban kids, El Tri is now open to players who were born and raised in the U.S. Not saying that fixes geopolitics, but it's a little nod to sharing a steamship to Uruguay in 1930. Lines on a map may divide us, but if you think about it, we're all kind of in the same boat.
Meanwhile, up north, the Canadian team now features a golden generation of professionals, led by Bayern Munich's Alphonso Davies, who was famously born to Liberian parents in a refugee camp in Ghana, and the family fled a civil war to be welcomed by Canada. Now he's the national team captain. But after all those years of playing the gentleman and suffering, Canada went out and hired an American.
Jesse Marsch was very publicly considered for the U.S. job before U.S. Soccer decided to bring Greg Berhalter back in 2023. And Jesse has been very public about U.S. Soccer's hiring process and his opinion of such.
Needless to say, Jesse grabbed the Canada job with both hands, and he's on a mission to prove a point about his management and his soccer. But what he found in his Canadian player pool was, well, lots of Canadians.
Quote, I found Canadians to be very amicable and respectful and kind, and that's great. But that doesn't always make the best football team, right? Unquote.
Jesse was a hard-nosed player, perfectly suited for the Red Bull style he came up in as a coach. But as he tried to instill it in his Canadian squad, he found the guys too polite. He wanted more nastiness.
Or, to put it another way, he wanted them to be a bit more American, to have some of that relentless, stupid confidence that they will prevail against any odds. After a strong run in the Copa America in 2024, defender Alistair Johnston said, quote, we played with arrogance, and that is something that Jesse brought in, unquote.
Something else that Jesse brought in? A Mexican player. Well, technically, Marcelo Flores was born in Canada, but his father was a Mexican pro, and Marcelo chose to represent Mexico back in 2022. This January, though, he announced he was switching his eligibility and would be in the Canadian player pool for this summer. So when the World Cup opens on June 11th and three nations stand together,
probably,
as co-hosts, we can appreciate the awkwardness of it all. We can lament the state of things while hoping and working for better days.
We can also remember the better days, going back over 100 years, when the U.S., Canada, and Mexico were not just good rivals, but often friendly ones. And we can find pieces of that shared experience of what unites us in the teams that take the field this summer.
And that's our story. See you next time on An American Game.
This episode of An American Game is a production of Soccertown Media and was written by me, Kirk Riddell.
And me, Tom McCabe.
If you want to hear more of my thoughts on soccer, Hollywood, or whatever I happen to be annoyed by, and the list is growing, you can find me on Blue Sky.
As for me, Kirk will have me in the archives digging up the next story. And on that Soccertown Media Instagram page.
An American Game is a team effort. Our consulting producer is the great Matthew Nelson.
Our videos are produced by Larry Garrity.
Our theme music was composed by our old friend and former teammate, the multi-talented, multi-hyphenate, Patrick White.
And thanks to you for listening.
That makes you part of the team. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, review, and tell your friends.
We'll see you next time on An American Game.